Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. I have got a very special guest joining us on today's episode. We're going to be talking about a whole host of issues that are currently bubbling up in the press, not the mainstream press, of course, but in the news centers of power online, and those I think many of you have come to probably do a great deal of research on your own as of late, as Tucker Carlson has been diving into this, as we look at the 9/11 story, the official narrative, and all the holes and gaps there, as well as Syria, because this month, 20 some odd years after 9/11, and we've got former leader of Al-Qaeda in New York meeting with David Petraeus. So it's a very, very odd time, but people are waking up. So joining me is Piers Robinson to discuss all of this. He's the co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, the co-editor of Propaganda in Focus, and he's the director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And really, I first became aware of Piers's work when he was covering the OPCW cover-up scandal surrounding the allegations of chemical weapons abuse by the Assad government in Syria. So, Piers, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. And just quick clarification, I'm the research director at the International Center for 9/11 Justice, not the director of the organization.
So what do you think about this renewed interest in 9/11 right now? You have Tucker Carlson coming out and exposing all of this. As someone who's committed so much of your professional career to this issue, again, we're only one, I guess, episode in on the public platforms. You can watch the full series, I guess, on his website. But do you think he's actually diving in deep enough to what needs to be uncovered here?
Well, he's starting to dip his toe properly into the pool. I'm not going to say he's diving all the way in or sufficiently. I haven't seen all of the episodes yet, but he's definitely dipping his toe in the pool. And, more broadly, I think what he's doing with his documentary series reflects a wider opening of discussion and debate on 9/11. So, for example, we had the Turning the Tide conference in Washington, D.C. last week, a 3-day conference. And we had Senator Ron Johnson spoke at that conference. Kucinich was there as well and spoke. Kurt Weldon, former representative, was there. So a lot of key political figures. We had the firefighter groups represented there. And this event in DC really represented, I think, potentially a turning point for 9/11 understanding amongst the wider public, given the people who were there. And, we're, as you mentioned, Syria, we're living in a world where there's an awful lot of deception, but we're also living in a world, as you correctly point out, that the new, as it were, information power centers, the alternative media, have been helping wake people up to the fact that we live in very undemocratic political systems with a lot of propaganda and a lot of deception and lies. And so I think with this kind of wider awakening you see with that, I think 9/11 is really now coming to the fore. And I think, some people are probably going to understandably criticize Tucker. Obviously, Tucker historically was not very nice to people who questioned 9/11. And he's admitted himself, he was pretty unfair and ferociously attacked people such as David Ray Griffin for questioning 9/11. But he's clearly now got to a point where he is willing to ask questions. And I think, in the same way that Ron Johnson at the Turning the Tide conference said, these are legitimate questions which people should ask, can ask, and should not be ashamed to ask. And Tucker's doing, I think with this series, will be doing a very good job of starting to ask those questions. And part of me thinks that once you open this kind of worms, so to speak, or once you get the ball rolling, there really is no going back. When people open their eyes to the problems of 9/11 and the official story, whether it's CIA involvement, whether it's the building issue, WTC-7, once you open your eyes, it's very difficult to close them again. And, I think we will get there in the end in terms of widespread understanding that we've been lied to about 9/11. And whether that means accountability for those involved, I'll put that to one side. I'm not sure whether that will happen in the medium term, but I am confident that we will reach a point where most people understand, have a reasonably accurate picture of what actually happened and how much we've been lied to. So the people will know, even if the governments don't concede, even if we don't necessarily have justice and accountability for those who perpetrated 9/11.
What would those vested interests be that seek to cover this up? Because right now you have the first episode out, and it's talking about the CIA and how they use Saudi intelligence domestically in the U.S. to spy on the 9/11, hijackers and whatnot, and they were providing them with food, shelter, so on and so forth, all this stuff. And the idea was to be able to pawn this all off on the Saudis. So just looking at that alone, I mean, is the reason why the Trump administration and all previous administrations of the U.S. government, that the reason why they don't want to touch this because of the, the guilty nature that the CIA played in this?
Yeah, I think that the bottom line and the massive political resistance to, allowing for proper investigation, for example, into the buildings or into 9/11 itself, the real driving force for this is that, what it means for our understanding of the government, of the US government, and what it means for our understanding of ideas such as the deep state. This was an event which was instigated in order to start major wars in the international system. We know this well, that the well-rehearsed Wesley Clark's 7 countries in 5 years and so on, of course, still playing out today. Successful this year or last year with Syria, Iran still in the crosshairs and so on. That's the obvious, immediate, sort of proximate explanation for why political actors were pushing and created the 9/11 event. But of course, what that means, without sort of beating around the bush, it means that these are actors within the US political system. This is the deep state at work. These are the same forces or similar forces to the ones that we see in relation to the assassination of Kennedy. And here they are with 9/11 instigating a false flag to start major wars, which have gone on for 25 years. So the stakes are incredibly high, because if everyone, and increasing numbers of people are realizing that, just as increasing numbers of people now realize what the story behind JFK and who assassinated JFK, if you have enough people realizing that, then you've got a major crisis for the existing political hierarchy. And, of course, that's often used as an argument by some that, well, maybe we don't want to open this can of worms because we don't want the whole world to fall around us. But actually, on something as serious as this, the only path out of this is to recognize how big a problem we have with the deep state. And it's going to be painful and it's going to be difficult, but unless we go through a process of revealing that truth and then starting the long kind of struggle to restructure our societies, and it's more than just America, it's also Western European countries as well, we're going to be confronted with the same problems again and again, with nefarious, deceptive acts being carried out against us in order to mobilize, manipulate us. We're on the cusp potentially of war with Russia, right? I mean, that's conceivable, and many mainstream-ish commentators are almost talking about this now, the possibility of a false flag. So, we need to come to terms with 9/11 and come to terms with what the deep state is capable of. And we need to do that not just for historical reckoning. We need to do it because this might all happen again. And, we could entertain various scenarios on a false flag in relation to Russia, sufficient enough to mobilize to propel us into a war with Russia. Pretty horrendous when you think what might be conceived of. Nuclear bombs going off in cities and so on, that kind of sum of all fears kind of propaganda, false flag, to get a war started. And we're not a million miles away, right, from war with Russia. So we have a problem with the same forces. So I think understanding 9/11 is a way to stop it happening again, to creating enough awareness and so on. So it becomes essential, and essential for the moment we're in. And Russia, Iran, Gaza, Israel's action in Gaza against the genocide against the Palestinians. These are extraordinary events, which if you'd told me all of these things would be happening when I was in my 20s, back in the 1990s, I'd be absolutely amazed that we're going to reach that point of crisis in the international system. But we're there now. So time to wake up and learn what our governments have been up to, I politely suggest.
I have full faith that, like you said, in these future episodes that Tucker's doing, hopefully there will be more deep questions being asked. But in your career, what have you uncovered as the biggest glaring, obvious questions that need to be answered about 9/11? Because for people that are just dipping their toes into this story, into trying to uncover the truth here, it might be a little bit hard to actually access this information because it's been hidden, suppressed, censored for so long. You have to go to these very difficult, hard to find websites to even access this stuff. Everyone, I think, is aware of the magic passport. Everyone is aware of the insanity of a group of guys in the middle of nowhere in a cave planning and committing the most incredible and disastrous and deadly terrorist attacks in modern human history. But what are the big questions that you think need to be answered, if you could rattle off a few that just don't make any sense about the official story?
Yeah, I mean, there are some very good starting points for people to who perhaps haven't thought about 9/11 in any critical way. There's some good starting points, and the obvious one is World Trade Center 7. I think I've seen and heard you and Jimmy Dore, I think, talking about Building 7. Okay, so you go back to Building 7. This is a building which came down 5-6 hours after the Twin Towers came down. It was in free fall for the first couple of seconds. Free fall meaning there was no resistance from any of the structure beneath. And that's a very good eye-opener, because when you start to think through carefully, what am I looking at here? What am I seeing? This is a building in free fall, collapsing 5 hours, not hit by a plane. And most people instinctively would react to this by saying, well, that looks like a controlled demolition. And that's what it appears to have occurred there. So that's a good entry point to thinking, okay, what we saw on the day doesn't make any sense. Building 7 doesn't make any sense. And of course, there's a huge research literature. There's the Halsey report, the University of Alaska Fairbanks study, which I think Jimmy Dore interviewed Halsey a couple of years back. The Journal of 9/11 Studies has lots of articles on WTC 7. So there's a kind of a deeper kind of sort of academic literature if people want to dig into that. But in a sense, you don't need to go there. You just need to look at the building and go, does that look as though it is just almost effectively spontaneously collapsed because of, as the official story says, a few isolated office fires in the building caused a progressive, immediate free-fall collapse of the building. Once you start from look at the towers, and there's a great piece, and I think it's on the web, but David Chandler, who's on our board at International Center for 9/11 Justice, talks about, if you look at I think it's the South Tower collapse, and you look very carefully at the film of this collapse, and you see the building coming down, at about 2/3 free fall. There's no resistance being given to this top section as it falls down. And from a physics point of view, this doesn't make any sense unless you have explosives clearing the way. Yeah. Then, as you look more carefully at this footage, which we all saw at the time, and we were just so shocked at what we were seeing. And of course, we were told, given the explanation straight away, well, it's the planes and the fires, and this caused the building to collapse. And we believe what we were being told because we were in such a state of shock. I'm sure you were, and I was, when we were seeing this as it was happening. But when you go back and you look at this footage again, you start to see explosive blasts coming out far ahead of the collapse front and so on, which can only be explained through explosives going off slightly too early. And then the basic physics of that top section of the building would not crush the entire lower section of the building. It would come to a halt at some point. So basic Newtonian physics are being violated according if you go with the official story. So I think those two things really, when you sit down and think, what am I seeing? What are you observing? And I do recommend David Chandler's video, which is available on the web, where he talks you through this from a scientist point of view of what you're seeing. Really, as soon as you open up that, then you go, well, okay, there's a very big problem with the official story. Other spaces you can go to are, of course, the hijacked aeroplanes and the plausibility of these planes having been flown and coordinated, flown by the alleged hijackers who were inexperienced, at most maybe a commercial pilot's license, limited time in a simulator, that they were able to not only successfully take over these planes, which if you look at the history of hijackings, attempts to forcefully take over control of the plane normally ends in failure. So they managed to do this 4 times on the day, and then they managed to fly these planes, in a very precise manner into the towers, into the Pentagon, allegedly. And, of course, there are a lot of pilots out there who say that this is not a plausible scenario. Myself at International Center for 9/11 Justice, and I gave a presentation on this at the Turning the Tide conference in Washington, D.C., where we've been doing this simulator study with experienced pilots and so on, and showing quite how difficult these maneuvers actually are. It doesn't really make any sense that it was Hani Hanjour who flew the plane, as alleged by the American government. So I think those are the more sort of scientific areas where if you sit down and think logically about what you're being presented with, you start thinking, yeah, this doesn't really make sense. So I think those are good starting points. And then I think if you want to come in it from the political angle, if science is not your thing, looking at PNAC, looking at Project for a New American Century, the war planning that was going on in the 90s, immediate aftermath of 9/11, you have Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister at the time, talking with George Bush about the war on terror phases 1 and 2, when to hit various countries. There's actually a communique between Bush and Blair a month after 9/11, where I think Blair says, well, if the priority is taking out Saddam and so on, maybe we just leave Iran and Syria and get them to acquiesce, deal with Iraq first before hitting those countries. So pretty blatant revealing of the planning that was going on. So if you think about the politics of this, who benefits from this? Who benefits from 9/11? What benefits are the people who are trying to drive America and the West, and Israel's part of that, into major global conflicts in the international system, all designed to shore up American hegemony, which is exactly what the neocons were saying in the 90s. We need to act fast and hard before China is dominating. And the way we need to do that is through projecting power, military force, war. To get a country to go support a population, to support wars on that scale, all of those countries, you need a big event, a massive event. And that's where 9/11 comes from. And that enables you to make sense of 9/11, why it was done. It was done by people who believed, rightly or wrongly, but believed that America had to engage in major wars to shore up its hegemony, its dominance, its imperial position into the 21st century. And to do that, they committed a terrible crime.
What about just a few more questions of things that have really stuck with me over the years? The Pentagon you mentioned. There was a video from maybe like 2 years ago, I think James O'Keefe released through a FOIA request, if I'm not mistaken, where it called into question it was a very blurry video, but it called into question the narrative that has long since been questioned about whether a plane actually flew into the Pentagon or whether it was a missile, what really went on there. So what's your take on that? And then also the stock trades that were happening right before 9/11, and how big were those? What was going on there? What parties were involved, or do we not know any of that? And the third one being Donald Rumsfeld. He gave some big speech right before 9/11, I believe. I think I read this in a book about the military-industrial complex and how there was this exorbitant amount of money that was missing from the Pentagon. And this was like almost the exact amount of money that was allocated for the war on terror. So what can you say about those things?
Well, first of all, on the Pentagon has been a heated debate amongst people who research 9/11, and actually at the Turning of the Tide conference, the third day was a discussion on the Pentagon. So we had people presenting these various positions on large plane, no large plane impact. So I recommend people, your viewers, take a look at that and see the various arguments. Myself, I'm currently starting to work on looking at the Pentagon issue and at the various theories out there. And at the moment, I'm still just at the start of that process. So I'm not going to, I don't have a position at the moment. But it is one of the things which, as a relatively new researcher into the 9/11 research community, I'm interested in really working through all of the arguments and evidence in relation to what happened at the Pentagon. It is interesting. I know from the simulator study that I'm working on at the moment, the flight profile allegedly flown of the plane, the descending turn and then pulling out to fly level with the grass is a challenging maneuver for even experienced pilots to carry out. That doesn't necessarily speak to whether or not a large plane went into the Pentagon, but it does question the official narrative that it was Hani Hanjour flying the plane. So that's as much as I'd say about the Pentagon, but it's, I recommend people take a look at, and I think it's Redacted have got it aired on their website, the Pentagon Day 3 discussion. Second one, the insider trading. Yep, that's a really important fact, that it's known that trades put options were being placed on American Airlines, United Airlines. And so these are basically bets on the stock going down. It was known, the individuals were known, but the 9/11 Commission made the comment that, well, these individuals couldn't possibly be connected to Al Qaeda, and then didn't pursue it any further. Well, it'd still be nice to know who clearly knew that 9/11 was about to happen. And that's very solid evidence, and it's evidence of foreknowledge. And I think, as with many of these sort of false flags, structural deep events is another term that's used, evidence of foreknowledge is extremely important. And with 9/11, that's an extremely important area. And I suppose moving forward, one of the demands is that there needs to be transparency on those individuals who did know it was about to happen. So we can ask them some questions. On the missing trillions, yes, Donald Rumsfeld had declared that very large sums of money were missing. And, this does connect into, I think, an argument has been developed, and I think it's reasonably well supported, that the section of the Pentagon which was allegedly hit by a flight American Airlines 77 was where some of the investigation of this was going on. I think that's the conclusion on that. So that raises a whole host of questions. I think it's important. What Rumsfeld said is important. I'd also add that, when governments pull off these kind of false flags, these kind of major deceptions, criminal acts and so on, they make sure that a lot of false trails are thrown out there in order to, because they know they're going to have people questioning what's going on. So they need to disrupt that questioning. So, and I'm not saying that what Donald Rumsfeld said is necessarily a false trail, but all the information you have circulating around 9/11, you need to think, well, okay, is this accurate, or is it just being injected into the mix in order to try and get people who are trying to get to the truth either become confused or start fighting with each other, which, I think happens, it's happened to a large extent with 9/11. But those are important areas. But I think the insider trading is, well, what can you say? So they know the people who knew that it was about to happen. So if you were a normal sort of average police officer investigating a crime, you'd want to question those people very quickly.
Of course. I want to shift gears to talk about the new Syrian president's inaugural visit to the United States, to Manhattan this week. First, your thoughts on this visit as someone who has spent so much time exposing the crimes of the various terrorist entities within Syria over the decade plus dirty war that the U.S. waged through those proxies. What does this mean to you? And what does it mean for, I guess, Westerners and Americans who are, on this, again, anniversary of 9/11, and here we are hosting an Al-Qaeda leader, or ISIS leader, former, that is, who is now leading Syria.
Well, I mean, it almost feels though, the lie is complete now, or the deception has reached it can't go any further. That you have somebody who is, Al-Qaeda linked, is now in New York being welcomed and celebrated 25 years after 9/11. Of course, as soon as you just look beneath the surface, you reach the point, well, yeah, they always were on our side. This is the big deception which has been carried out, this idea that we're fighting Islamic fundamentalist terrorists and so on, when actually they're operating with us and so on, in order to enable us to pursue these regime change wars. So, in one sense, you think it in the kind of George Orwell sort of terms, well, the deception has reached that point where reality is well and truly inverted. At the same time, a lot of people are pointing out the absurdity of this. So one wonders, does the narrative start to crack a little bit more now that Jolani is standing there? And I think that, as the work that you've done and others have done on the dirty war against Syria, I think, we have, all of us between us, pulled together a lot of evidence over time. And I think we will be able to help people in due course, as with 9/11, understand the realities of the man who's been put in place now. It's essentially a regime change. Well, he's there because of the MI6 and CIA, etc. And understand the lies which led to the overthrow of the Syrian government. The Syrian government was overthrown through a concerted 14-year effort supporting extremist groups, Jolani, for example, people who happily cut off people's heads, etc., supporting those groups, and then telling lies about Syria. And of course, the big one, and what I've been involved with, is the deception over chemical weapons use, whether it's Ghouta 2013 or Duma 2018, when the OPCW whistleblowers, Brendan Whelan in Henderson, revealed the corruption of their investigation of that particular attack. Western publics have been presented with a major lie about chemical weapons use. And, as someone who's researching this and also writing a book on this in due course, some of these alleged chemical weapons attacks, and some are just completely staged, but some are staged with the involvement of murdered civilians. Duma is one example, Ghouta is another. So these characters who are now in charge, such as Jolani, these characters are linked to the groups who are carrying out these kind of atrocities. And you're very familiar with Duma. You know that there were 34 plus civilians who were found in that apartment block. They weren't murdered on the spot. They were not killed by chlorine gas. The NATO toxicologist made that clear. They were killed somewhere else. We know that blood was taken from some of the deceased. Yeah, and the Americans claimed initially that showed nerve agent. When you think through the logic of that, what that means, because no nerve agent was ever found at the building, which is why they said, it's chlorine gas, not nerve agent, which killed them. It means that people were killed somewhere else. Yeah. So these are the kind of sort of investigative avenues which I'm pursuing in the coming months and years on it. But anyway, what that means is that we have been involved in either directly or turning a blind eye to the murder of civilians for the purposes of staging chemical attacks in order to frame the Syrian government for a long time. And I think if you look across all of the cases, you've got multiple intelligence agencies involved at various points. MI6, certainly a key player. Also French intelligence, also Mossad Israeli intelligence, also the Turkish intelligence as well. This is a very dirty secret, which Western governments and Jolani in particular will be very keen on obfuscating. But the facts are there, and that's what's been going on. So, part of me feels that, okay, this is in one sense, the new truth or of the big lie is now being consolidated with Jolani appearing in front of the UN General Assembly. But what I say is that the facts are there and the evidence is there, and over time, we will bring that to the forefront, and people will understand the reality of quite how dirty this war was, in order to overthrow the Syrian government and bring to power as you said at the start, formally ideologically linked to our supposed enemies, Al-Qaeda, power in Syria. Quite aside from all the bloodshed which continues in Syria, as you know, with massacres going on, etc., of Alawites.
I think it's the only time Wikipedia has ever told a damning truth. They have like ISIS and Al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda on Jolani's Wikipedia pages as former, places of occupation, I guess. But Piers Robinson, thank you so much for joining me today. And I think everyone should obviously take a much closer look at the work you're doing. So, and because if they can cover up 9/11, and obviously there was various agencies, interagency government cover-ups and involvement there. If they can do that, if they can wage a decade plus long war on Syria and overthrow the government and kill all these people in the most gruesome of ways and stage these chemical attacks, what are they going to do in the future? That's the question that everyone needs to ask. So where are the best places for people to follow along with your work moving forward?
Well, certainly International Center for 9/11 Justice, IC911 website is a good place to go. I edit Propaganda and Focus, so we have a lot of academics writing articles on propaganda on a wide range of subjects and so on. So I think that's a good place to go. I'm active on Twitter, Piers Robinson 1, and there's sort of links to all the organizations, groups who I work with on that Twitter handle, so people can check out there. But those are the main areas to go to.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. It's good to talk with you.